France, in the middle of the 16th century, was a country weary of glory and hungry for bread. The long wars that had once carried French arms into Italy had left behind not triumph so much as taxation, and the very splendor of the Renaissance, which had taught princes to build palaces and patrons to collect art, had taught the people, by contrast, the bitter arithmetic of inequality. Over this older discontent there came a newer division, sharper than any quarrel of province or class: the fracture of Christendom. When a civilization has lived for centuries on the assumption of one faith and one church, it does not easily discover how to live with two. And when men begin to read salvation as a partisan banner, they do not remain content with disputation. Theology becomes politics, politics becomes war, and the street learns to speak the language of the pulpit. The Reformation entered France not as a mere import from Germany, but as a response to native needs. There had long been critics of ecclesiastical wealth, scandal, and absentee prelates. There had long been devout souls who wanted a simpler Christianity than the one offered by courts and cardinals. Yet it was not the French temperament to accept a reform that remained only a whisper. When Calvin's severe logic and disciplined piety crossed the frontier, it found minds that relished clarity and wills that could endure hardship. And it found, too, a number of nobles who perceived in the new creed a weapon against the crown and the guise. Thus the French Protestants, soon called Huguenots, with a name half nickname and half slur, were born not only from religion, but from the complicated chemistry of ambition, resentment, conviction, and fear. For the monarchy, these were dangerous ingredients. The Valois line, brilliant in spectacle, was fragile in statesmanship and increasingly unlucky in heirs. Francis II reigned too briefly to learn how to reign. Charles IX succeeded too young to command obedience without guidance. And into that vacuum stepped Catherine de' Medici, a Florentine by birth, a French queen by marriage, and a politician by necessity. History has rarely been kind to such a woman. Posterity prefers its villains unambiguous and its saints immaculate. Catherine was neither. She was an intelligent survivor in a court that rewarded charm and punished weakness, and she tried, with the tools available to her, to keep France from dissolving into the private wars of its great houses. Those houses were ready for blood. The Guises, militant Catholics with a following that combined genuine devotion and factional loyalty, saw themselves as champions of the old faith and guardians of the realm against heresy. The Bourbons, princely in lineage and often Protestant in sympathy, felt excluded from the center of power and determined to recover it. Around these poles swung lesser nobles, city leaders, preachers, lawyers, and a populace trained by years of anxiety to suspect conspiracy in every deviation. The first wars of religion, beginning with the massacre at Vassy in 1562, had already shown France what a civil war is. Not a clash of uniforms on a distant field, but a neighbor's torch, a sudden ambush, a church defiled, a family broken, and an economy that rots while armies march. Peace was attempted, signed, betrayed, and signed again. Edicts promised toleration and were answered with riots. Truces were made in exhaustion and broken in renewed zeal. The Crown, lacking money and decisive force, tried to arbitrate between factions that did not want arbitration. Catherine, with the patience of a woman forced to negotiate among men who preferred to fight, leaned now toward conciliation, now toward repression, and always toward the survival of the monarchy. In 1570, the Peace of Saint-Germain offered the Huguenots a measure of security and worship. It also returned their chief leader, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, to influence at court. Coligny was no mere doctrinaire. He was a soldier, a statesman, and a man of austere conscience. He had suffered defeat and remained unbroken, and his integrity gave him a power that intrigues cannot easily counterfeit. It is one of the ironies of history that men who sincerely seek peace can become the unwitting instruments of catastrophe. Catherine believed that a great dynastic marriage might bind the parties together. Let the king's sister, Marguerite de Valois, beautiful, clever, and bred in the art of courtly ambiguity, marry Henry of Navarre, the young Bourbon prince, whose Protestantism made him the natural hope of the Huguenots. A wedding, with its music and ritual, could be presented as a national reconciliation. It could also, in the colder calculation of politics, place a Protestant prince within reach, visible and manageable, while giving the crown leverage over his followers. Plans that look balanced on paper often ignore the volatile element of human feeling, and Paris, at least, was not a city that felt reconciled. As August 1572 approached, Huguenot nobles came to Paris in splendid retinues. They entered a capital that had been fed for years on sermons depicting them as wolves in Christian clothing. Paris was intensely Catholic, not only in doctrine but in identity. The saints' days structured its calendar, processions gave it pageantry, monasteries and parishes organized its charities, and the University of Paris guarded orthodoxy with the jealous pride of an intellectual fortress. The city's guilds, its students, and its poorer quarters were easily stirred, and in any age the poor are the most available army because they can be summoned by fear, by hope of plunder, or by the intoxicating sense that violence makes them momentarily important. Pamphlets and rumors multiplied. Some said the Huguenots planned to kidnap the king, others that they meant to massacre Catholics in revenge for past wrongs. In such a climate, a spark did not need to be large to start a fire. The wedding itself, meant to symbolize unity, displayed division. On August 18th, Henry of Navarre, a Protestant, could not participate in the Catholic Mass at Notre Dame as a believing communicant. He stood outside or at the threshold while the sacramental heart of the ceremony took place within. Paris watched, and many did not watch with goodwill. The festivities that followed were magnificent. Banquets, tournaments, fireworks, the whole theatrical language by which monarchies persuade nations that the crown is the center of order. Yet beneath the silk and gold there was tension. Huguenot gentlemen, proud and armed, moved through streets where a hostile crowd could gather in minutes. Catholic nobles, especially those linked to the Guises, felt humiliated to see heretics honored at court. Catherine watched all this with the wary eyes of someone who knows that splendid occasions can cover, but not cure, profound animosities. Meanwhile, Coligny drew closer to the young king. Charles IX, impressionable and eager to assert himself, seemed to find in the admiral a steadier counsel than in the factions around him. Coligny urged a policy that alarmed Catherine: intervention against Spain in the Netherlands, support for Protestant rebels there, and a broader war that might unite France by turning its energies outward. Such a plan had a certain logic. Nations often escape internal hatred by exporting it. A foreign war can make domestic enemies temporarily comrades, but it also risked provoking Spain, the most powerful Catholic monarchy of the age, and it threatened to give Coligny and the Huguenot party military prestige that could translate into political dominance. Catherine, who had navigated too many storms to trust enthusiasm, saw in Coligny's influence not only a policy dispute, but a possible displacement of her own position and a danger to the crown's independence. On August 22nd, as Coligny returned from the Louvre to his lodging, a shot rang out from a window. The bullet tore into him, mangling a hand and wounding an arm, and he fell bleeding while his companions shouted for help. The assassin escaped. Paris instantly became a city holding its breath. The Huguenot leaders, already gathered in large numbers, interpreted the attempt as a Guise plot, and they were not without reasons. Coligny had long been the enemy of the Guises. Old vendettas in France were as durable as stone, and the memory of a murder could be inherited like a title. Huguenot gentlemen crowded into the king's presence, demanding justice with a tone that could sound, to anxious ears, like threat. Charles visited the wounded admiral, offered assurances, and spoke with indignation against the perpetrators. Yet assurances are a weak currency when suspicion has become the common coin. Here the tragedy tightened like a rope. Catherine and her advisers confronted an ugly dilemma. If the crown punished Guy's men, it might provoke Catholic uprising in Paris and civil war among the nobility. If it failed to punish, it would alienate the Huguenots, who might take revenge themselves, perhaps by seizing the king or striking at Catholic leaders. The Huguenots, gathered in strength, were both guests and potential hostages, but guests with armed retinues can become conquerors if the host hesitates. In the corridors of the Louvre, the air was thick with calculation, fear, and the old human temptation to solve a political problem by eliminating persons. To the men who decided in those hours, murder could appear not as a crime, but as a surgery. Remove a few leaders, and the fever will subside. The king's council met. Accounts differ, as they always do when fear and secrecy govern, but the essential outline stands. Catherine, joined by hard men who distrusted Coligny and the Protestant party, pressed for decisive action. Charles wavered. He was a young man trapped between factions, burdened with the symbolism of kingship, but lacking the power that would make it effortless. At last, after argument, pleading, and perhaps a kind of emotional blackmail, the suggestion that his mother, his brothers, and he himself might be killed, he consented to a strike against the Huguenot leaders. Later writers would imagine him shouting that they should kill them all so that no one would be left to reproach him. Whether or not he spoke such words, the logic of Massacre has always been to outrun accountability by outrunning survivors. Orders went out quietly. The city militia was alerted, certain gates were watched, and Catholic loyalists were prepared. The target, in the first intention, was limited: Coligny and a handful of prominent Huguenot nobles. But violence, once unleashed, seldom respects the boundaries set by conspirators. In the dark early hours of August 24th, the feast of Saint Bartholomew, the bell of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois near the Louvre sounded. It was a signal in a city whose people understood bells not only as calls to prayer, but as alarms, summonses, and commands. Men armed themselves. Bands formed. The palace guarded itself, and in a moment the planned execution of leaders began to swell into a popular slaughter. Coligny, still wounded, lay in his lodging, attended by friends and servants. A troop forced its way in. Accounts again vary in detail, but not in outcome. The admiral was killed, stabbed, struck, finished, and his body was thrown from a window to the men below. The Duke of Guise, present or near, demanded proof. The corpse was identified, and in the brutal theater of faction, the body became a trophy. It was mutilated, dragged, and dishonored, as if hatred needed to destroy not only a life, but the memory of dignity. There is something in civil war that turns opponents into demons, and once a man is imagined as a demon, any cruelty feels like exorcism. At the Louvre, the king's guards and loyalists moved against the Huguenot nobles who had come for the wedding. Some were killed in their rooms, surprised while sleeping, still trusting the royal hospitality that had invited them. Others fought desperately in corridors and courtyards. The palace that was supposed to embody order became a labyrinth of pursuit and screams. Henry of Navarre and the young Prince of Condé were spared, not by mercy, but by usefulness. They were too valuable to kill. They were pressured, threatened, and in effect coerced into Catholic conformity, at least outwardly, as the price of survival. Few bargains are more bitter than the bargain made at sword point with one's conscience. but in such moments conscience often yields to the simple insistence of life. Outside, the city took the cue and added its own passions. Parisian crowds poured into the streets, hunting Huguenots by rumor, by denunciation, by the crude tests that mobs invent, whether a man could recite a prayer properly, whether his accent betrayed a province, whether his name sounded suspicious. Doors were broken, houses were looted, bodies fell into alleys and were thrown into the Seine, turning the river into a conveyor of death. Some Catholics hid Protestant neighbors, paying with their own lives if discovered. Some Protestants escaped by bribery or disguise, but the general motion was toward murder, and murder became contagious. When a city believes it has permission from authority to kill, the ordinary restraints of law and custom dissolve, and the old animal within man, long domesticated, emerges with a terrible freedom. The massacre lasted not for an hour, but for days. It is difficult for later ages, accustomed to the idea that governments monopolize violence, to understand how a royal decision could become a civic frenzy. But 16th century France was a world in which city militias and neighborhood bands were real powers, in which religion saturated identity, and in which rumor could travel faster than official decrees. Once killing began, many joined not out of theology, but out of fear. Fear that if they did not strike first, they would be struck. Fear that neutrality would be interpreted as treason. Others joined for profit because the dead do not protest theft. Others joined because the crowd offered a kind of absolution. In a mob, responsibility is diluted, and the individual feels himself washed clean by shared guilt. Charles IX, awakening to the magnitude of what had been set in motion, issued orders at times to restrain the violence. But the very fact that he had sanctioned the initial killings destroyed the moral authority of his restraint. Authority that gives license cannot easily withdraw it. The court attempted to justify the action as a necessary blow against a Huguenot conspiracy. Diplomatic letters were sent to provincial governors to explain, to direct, to contain, or, in some cases, to encourage. Yet the provinces heard not a careful policy, but a rumor of blood. In the age before reliable communications, a massacre in the capital could be interpreted in a provincial town as a command, a warning, or an invitation. Some local leaders refused to imitate Paris, others embraced the opportunity to settle scores under a cloak of righteousness. Thus, the violence spread beyond Paris, unevenly, with different rhythms and motives, but with the same dreadful pattern. In Orléans, Lyon, Toulouse, Bordeaux, and other places, Huguenots were hunted, imprisoned, and killed. Sometimes municipal authorities tried to protect them. Sometimes the authorities were complicit. Sometimes the killings were sudden, sometimes delayed, until rumors hardened into panic. In a few cities the massacre was resisted, and the very fact of resistance shows that the event was not an irresistible natural disaster, but a human choice repeated in many hands. Estimates of the dead range widely. Thousands in Paris, perhaps several thousand more across France, with older polemics inflating the number to tens of thousands. The exact arithmetic matters less than the human meaning. In a nation already wounded by civil war, the state and the street together delivered a message that a minority could be annihilated when it became inconvenient. Europe watched, and Europe interpreted according to its own fears. Catholic Rome rejoiced, seeing in the event a triumph over heresy. Protestant Geneva and London shuddered, seeing in it a confirmation that Catholic power was intrinsically murderous. Medals were struck, sermons preached, pamphlets printed. The massacre became not only a French tragedy, but a European symbol, and symbols have a life longer than facts. The Huguenots learned that royal promises could be revoked overnight. Protestant princes learned that diplomacy with Catholic monarchs might be fatal. Catholic militants learned, disastrously, that violence could be sanctified by success. Each side found in the event the proof of what it had already believed, and thus the massacre did not end conflict. It deepened it. In France, the immediate political consequence was not peace but renewed war. Huguenot communities, now convinced that survival required fortification, held out in strong towns. La Rochelle became a center of resistance, and the crown, having shattered trust, had to expend blood and treasure to reassert control. The monarchy had hoped to decapitate a movement. Instead, it had transformed it. Leaders can be killed, but causes fed by martyrdom become more fervent. The massacre also altered the internal psychology of the court. A government that commits a crime of this magnitude becomes hostage to its own deed. It must justify, repeat, or deny, and in any case, it is no longer free. The crown's role as impartial arbiter between factions was compromised. The Valois monarchy, already weakened, had damaged the very legitimacy that might have saved it. Catherine de' Medici stands at the center of the moral storm, and it is tempting to make her the simple author of the massacre. Yet history is rarely simple, and the lure of a single villain is often a confession of intellectual laziness. Catherine did not invent religious hatred in France. She inherited it. She did not command the Parisian mob. She feared it. She did not possess a strong army or a stable treasury. She possessed only intrigue, marriage alliances, and the fragile authority of a queen mother in a patriarchal court. None of this absolves her. It merely restores proportion. She made a choice, whether in panic, calculation, or both, to remove political enemies by violence. She underestimated the forces she was unleashing, or she believed, with the fatal optimism of conspirators, that she could manage the aftermath. The result was a stain not only on her name, but on the monarchy she tried to protect. As for Charles IX, he carried the massacre like a poison. A king may command deaths in war and still sleep, but a king who commands murders in his own capital against men who came as guests cannot easily escape the judgment of his own mind. Contemporary observers noted his physical and psychological decline, and whether later accounts dramatized it or not, the internal logic is clear. To be the symbol of justice and to authorize injustice is to crack one's own identity. Charles died in 1574, still young, leaving behind a realm not pacified but more bitterly divided, and leaving behind the enduring question of whether he had been a decisive author of the massacre or a frightened instrument of stronger wills. In either case, the crown had revealed weakness, and weakness in a civil war invites predators. The succession brought Henry III, a man of intelligence and contradictions, pious and political, capable of charm and cruelty. Under him the wars of religion continued, complicated now by the Catholic League, which sought to control the monarchy in the name of faith. France seemed trapped in a cycle. Each attempt at settlement offended zealots on one side, each concession provoked retaliation on the other, and each act of violence created grievances that demanded new violence to avenge. The massacre had not merely killed thousands. It had killed the possibility of easy compromise. It taught men to treat negotiation as a trap and moderation as naivete. When the center collapses, the extremes become the only apparent realities. Yet history, stubbornly, often finds a way back to pragmatism. Henry of Navarre, spared in 1572 because he was useful, would in time become the central figure in France's rescue. He escaped the court, returned to Protestant leadership, fought, negotiated, endured defeats, and learned that a king in a divided nation must be more than a factional chief. When he inherited the claim to the throne and struggled through the final wars, he eventually chose conversion to Catholicism as the price of Paris and of peace, an act often summarized by a cynical phrase: but in truth a complex decision by a man who understood that politics is the art of the possible, and that ideals without a state to protect them become mere elegies. He became Henry IV, and under him France began, slowly, to heal. The Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting substantial rights to Protestants, was in part an answer to the lesson written in blood on St. Bartholomew's Day, that a state which cannot tolerate a religious minority condemns itself to perpetual rebellion. The edict was not modern liberty. It was a compromise shaped by suspicion, limiting worship, and assigning fortified places. But it was a recognition that unity enforced by massacre is not unity, but silence, and silence is temporary. Later generations would revoke that edict, and France would again pay the price of intolerance. Yet the very oscillation between repression and concession reveals a long, painful education. Societies do not learn tolerance by preaching alone, but by discovering, through repeated disasters, that coercion of conscience is an endless war against the invisible. What, then, was the massacre, beyond its immediate horror? It was the collision of ideas with institutions unprepared to contain them. The medieval synthesis, one church, one creed, one public truth, had provided a kind of psychological shelter, and when that shelter cracked, men did not at once invent pluralism. They tried first to restore unity by force. They imagined that if error could be eliminated, peace would return. But error, in matters of faith, is a name each side gives to the other's conviction, and to eliminate conviction, you must eliminate people. Thus, a theological dispute became a demographic project, and politics became a theology of extermination. There is also, in the event, a reminder of how quickly the crowd can be educated in cruelty when authority gives permission. The Parisian killers were not all monsters in private life. Many were ordinary men in an extraordinary moment, taking cues from sermons, leaders, and fear. Civilization is a thin garment. It holds when stitched by law, habit, and mutual trust, but it tears under the strain of propaganda and panic. The massacre shows that the difference between a city and a jungle can be a bell, a rumor, and a whispered order from a palace. And yet, even in such darkness, there were fragments of light. Catholics who hid Protestants, officials who refused to obey, neighbors who remembered friendship more than doctrine. These exceptions do not erase the crime, but they remind us that history is not a machine, and human nature is not a single substance. In every epoch, the same species produces both the fanatic and the skeptic, the executioner and the rescuer. The tragedy of St. Bartholomew's Day is not only that men killed for God, but that they believed they were serving God by killing. And when any ideal is treated as a permission slip for cruelty, the ideal itself becomes a corpse dragged through the streets. If we seek a final lesson, it may be this: that the state which allies itself too closely with absolute truth, in religion or ideology, inherits the quarrels of that truth and is tempted to solve them by force. The modern world, in its better moments, has tried to separate the machinery of government from the salvation of souls, not because it despises religion, but because it has learned, through catastrophes like this one, that souls cannot be governed like provinces. The massacre was a failure of politics and a failure of faith, politics reduced to assassination, faith reduced to hatred. France would, after long suffering, find again the ordinary virtues of administration, commerce, and law. And Europe would, after centuries, edge toward the idea that a man's path to God is not a matter for the sword. But on that August dawn in 1572, when the bell sounded and the Seine began to carry bodies, those later ideas were still far away, and the present belonged to the ancient gods of fear, vengeance, and the fatal certainty that one's own righteousness justifies another man's death.